chart put out by the Chicago Fed portraying how the monetary system works, and it really doesn't. They did that for decades and then they stopped. And Professor Keaton's work has examined what really happens in a monetary system. His book is at the back of the room, available, and it's a very, very strong critique debunking economics. So without any further time here, here's Professor Stephen.
I've got a lot of slides, so I'm going to go fairly quickly through some of them. I apologise for that, but even with an hour, I've really got too much material. How's the audio at the back? Can you hear me clearly? Good. Okay. I'm, as Michael Hudson also is, and Dirk Bessemer and a handful of other economists, always been concerned about the level of private debt and see that as a driving factor in the economy. So I predicted a crisis. The first time I came out public as saying it was December of 2005. And what I said would be a crisis when the rate of growth of debt slowed down. And of course, I expected something like this to happen in the future, which obviously it has done, a dramatic turnaround in the rate of growth of debt. And for the first time since the Great Depression, the level of private debt is falling compared to GDP. Now, economists didn't take any notice of that because even this is the long-term history of the ratio of private debt to GDP, and if we had infinitely lived agents like neoclassical economists fantasize with, they would have been there for the Great Depression and they'd recognise the similarities. Of course, they all grew up at this period when there was nothing but rising debt and their models didn't include debt at all. Now, of course, if you leave something out of your modelling, which is actually fundamental, and it's going in the same direction for the entire time you develop your models will be right until this happens, which is what's happened to most neoclassical models. So I argue the only way you can understand the crisis is by including what happens with private debt. And to give you and this has most conventional economists, actually not just conventional economists, quite a few non-neoclassical economists as well, believe I'm double counting when I show you this sort of analysis. But this is looking at the level of nominal GDP over the last decade or so, and the BNP stroke down there is when the Banque Nationale de Paris shut down its three funds back on August 9, 2007. That's now taken as the beginning of the crisis. Now you can see the turnaround in GDP began after that. It's certainly there, but it's not overwhelmingly powerful. So it's hard just looking at that to say, where did this crisis come from? What's the exogenous shock, as most neoclassical economists would put it? I definitely exclude Michael Kumar from this, okay? Well and truly. But most neoclassical look at that and think, we can't understand where did it come from? What's the exogenous shock? We can include the change of debt as well. Adding change of debt on top of GDP, it's fairly obvious what the change was. That's adding, the blue line adds the change in debt, private debt every year to GDP. And I then say that's the actual measure of aggregate demand, the sum of GDP plus the change in debt, and the turnaround from rising debt to falling debt is what triggered the crisis. Of course, the rising debt beforehand gave us the false boom. Now, conventional economics completely ignores private debt and has two main theoretical reasons for it. One is, I don't think it finally is dying, but they still teach it. It's still in brand new textbooks, the efficient markets hypothesis. And this argues that the gearing that investors or firms have is irrelevant. All that matters is the discounted future earnings of an asset. That's what set asset market prices. Now, they've completely proven that to be false, but it's still being taught because they can't think of anything else to teach. At the individual level, when they look at how individuals behave, a lot of the macro models explicitly say we assume no Ponzi schemes. Wouldn't that be great? Let's assume there's no Bernie Madoff. It's even cheaper than jailing him. Now, except for Michael, and I'm emphasising how different Michael's work is to conventional economic theory, is in macroeconomics they believe what's called loanable funds. And I'll explain that in more detail later, but the basic idea is that banks are irrelevant. Conventional economic theory says banks don't matter. They're simply intermediaries between people saving money and people borrowing money. And all this is not based on empirical research, couldn't possibly be. It's based on a priori reasoning. Now, to show that this is still happening after the crisis, I went looking for a few new economic papers which included the assumption of no Ponzi schemes. And here are three. The first one links to something in my paper. The second is linked to a web paper. Econ 504, that's got to be an honours course or master's or introductory PhD. A lecture in macroeconomics, page 17 of that one. Another one on representative agents. Despite 5 years of crisis, they are still teaching. 5 years of crisis caused by Ponzi behaviour. They are still teaching that you can model the economy and comfortably assume there are no Ponzi schemes, because if you have Ponzi schemes, then your model doesn't close. I'm sorry, your model should be closed. And I mean that in the pejorative sense. So Michael's about the only exception to really take this stuff seriously within a neoclassical framework. Because if you model a world in which nothing can go wrong, well, guess what? Nothing does go wrong in your model. But your model's also wrong. So we need models that actually things can go wrong in. Well, that's what we don't get. So looking at what's happened with conventional economics, it reminds me of how Keynes once described Hayek, saying that his work was an extraordinary example of how starting with a mistake, a remorseless logician can end up in bedlam. And the alternative logic that I want to reach go from sense to a sensible model comes from both Schumpeter and Minsky, who argue that private debt plays an essential role in capitalism, and the fundamental point from Schumpeter is it funds new entrepreneurs. Minsky argues as well and elaborates on Schumpeter on the same point, that new debt enables aggregate demand to expand. And this is not understood even by some of Minsky's followers. Of course, also Minsky argues they finance Ponzi schemes or an essential part of his model rather than assuming they don't exist. And the consequence of their analysis is that rising debt adds to aggregate demand, and therefore you must actually look at the role of aggregate debt in aggregate demand. And that sounds like double counting, but I'll prove that it's not later on in the piece. And I'm sorry, but I'm going to also use the mathematics. It's not quite as complicated as Michael's, but there was some mathematics there. First of all, I'll talk about Schumpeter on why debt matters. And what he sees as the essence of change in the capitalist economy is using existing goods and services in new ways. Entrepreneurs taking existing concepts and building new ones out of them. And he said this leads to the heresy that the means of payment perform an essential function. So that what happens with the monetary system is not just a reflection in the reverse of what's happening with transfer of goods. And as he points back in his day, we're talking back in the 1930s now, with rare unanimity, even with impatience and moral and intellectual indignation, a very long line of theorists have assured us of the opposite. I'm still copying that today. Even when you suggest that money might matter, you cop attacks from neoclassical economists. Now he then concludes that in real life, total credit, which means total spending, must be greater than it could be if they're only fully covered, by which he means credit, by which he means spending financed by selling goods and services. So that is the starting point of Schumpeter's analysis. And he's arguing credit is more than just being previously saved income. And his point here is that you are emphasizing that credit comes not from people selling goods, saving some of what they earned and then lending that out. It's created ad hoc. And he says this is the essential thing about a credit system. It's the creation of purchasing power, not simply the transfer of existing purchasing power, which is the Loanable Funds perspective. And he says, where did this money come from? He says, the conventional answer is from savings. Now he goes through and says, well, okay, there is some thrift. He's not denying there is some thrift as part of where funds for investment comes from. But he said if that was all there was, there wouldn't be very much of it. There'd be a very small level of investment that would be feasible. So I love the way he puts this. Even though the conventional answer is not obviously absurd, okay, it takes a bit of thinking to realize that it is absurd. He says there's another way which doesn't presuppose accumulated past funds. That is the creation of purchasing power by banks. And as you said, it's a question not of transforming existing power, but of creating new purchasing power out of nothing. This is an entire tradition in economics that has been completely ignored in the development of the neoclassical school of thought, which is a great pity. So he starts off by accepting a neoclassical foundation, which is Walras' law, and then said, but if you're in the equilibrium where the sum of all excess demands is zero, and everybody's getting what they deserve and pay, etc., etc., he said, therefore, essentially, profits are zero. Now, I disagree with this. I don't start from Walras' law. I'll start from a different monetary calculation when I do my own work here. But he says quite correctly that if you are in this general equilibrium state, then there is no entrepreneurial profit. There'll be the normal rate of return as neoclassical economists describe it, but there'd be no profit. Now, we live in a system driven by profit, so where does profit come from? He says, well, we can't just restrain ourselves to describing the system in a state of rest. We must also describe the process of change that gets us there. And he says profit arises from that process of change, which the conventional theory can't understand because it does not have a theory of profit. Now, in a deep sense, that's fundamentally true. They only have a theory what they call the normal profit, which is where the rate of profit is the same as the cost of capital, which is the same as the rate of interest, or they have supernormal profit, which they blame on monopoly or uncompetitive structures. So in their pure model, there's no profit at all. So ironically, the theory of capitalism that dominates, not the understanding of capitalism, does not have a theory of where profit comes from, which is fundamental to capitalism. Do we need, Schumpeter argued for the need for a model of discontinuous change, disturbing the equilibrium that he accepted was well described by Volra. Now, again, here we go, talking about the conventional tools. Even though he saw Volra as being an important foundation, he said these tools fail where economic life changes in fits and starts. So he said static analysis can't tell us what's going to happen because of discontinuous change. It can't explain the occurrence of productive revolutions or what flows from them. It can only tell us the equilibrium after all that change has passed through. So he said we have to have a disequilibrium theory. He starts off with a neoclassical starting point and then adds qualitative change. And he says profit will come out of one of 5 instances. You either introduce a new good or a new method of production or open up a new market or get new supplies or, this is the one I don't particularly agree with, mergers and acquisitions. They normally cost money rather than making it, but that's his 5th point. And he says, let's look at how, when you bring in a new product, how you change the pricing of products and change the foundations of the way the economy operates as well. So there's no entrepreneurial activity in equilibrium. So you have to have an entrepreneur in Schumpeter's vision to explain where change comes from. And the entrepreneur, he classically describes as somebody who's a person with a new idea and no money. And of course, that makes it very difficult to make his point. He's actually making an assumption that makes the point he's trying to prove harder rather than easier. So he says the entrepreneur needs credit because he doesn't have goods and services that have already provided income for him or her. He has to get it from ab initio with no current source of income. So therefore, you've got to borrow it. So to become an entrepreneur, you must first become a debtor. And that's a necessity. It's not an abnormal thing, it's a necessity. So he said the typical debtor in a capitalist society is the entrepreneur. A very unusual starting point compared to conventional economic thinking. Now, he assumes, first of all, that all innovation is done by new firms and that all resources are currently fully employed. Now, that's really actually make his point, to come in with assumptions like that and to make his point he's trying to make is harder than assuming innovation is done by existing firms and that there's unemployed resources. Okay? So he's actually made assumptions that actually make it harder for him to make his point. But I think that's the way we should use assumptions, rather than let's assume there's no Ponzi behaviour. Okay? A very, very different way to use assumptions than tends to apply in conventional economic thinking. Now, his first stage, he says you have to innovate, you've got to have the concepts first of all, but you have no retained earnings. So you've got to get credit. You get the credit. And that's what he calls capitalists. He's really describing the financial sector as what we would call venture capitalists today. And then the bank, this is seeing the banker doing what a banker should do, which bankers almost never do today. Okay, this is the correct role for banking in a capitalist economy. So the banker is not just a middleman, which is the conventional loanable funds position, it's a producer of purchasing power, okay, through the double entry bookkeeping exercises that Michael's been talking about. So rather than the conventional perspective being that anybody who thinks money matters suffers from what they call money illusion, and there's a prominent blog that uses that title these days, I would say that economists suffer from barter illusion. To imagine you can model something as complicated as a capitalist economy and pretend that it doesn't have money, or banks, or debt. But that's what conventional thinking does. So once you purchase the goods and services you need by getting credit, you then combine them in some revolutionary way. I recently met the man who invented FPOS, and he told me the tale of him making the machines that did FPOS. Now, in fact, he's somebody who fits in the category of had a tiny income stream, and he used that to make the FPOS machines, and then he sold what was costing him $80 to $100 to make in his mother's kitchen, I am not joking, to Debt Corporation for $11,000 each. That's what I call a fairly major example of a new mean of production that dramatically drops your costs. So this innovation gives you an advantage over incumbents, and you profit from that innovation until the rest of them catch up with you. So he's saying that this profit source doesn't exist in equilibrium, but it does when somebody comes in and breaks the trend with a new approach, a new technology. They get receipts that are much greater than their costs, and that's the source of profit. So his example, Schumpeter's example, was the power loom, which is the first step of going from, the first true industrialization was bringing in power into textile manufacturing. And if you take a look at the original designs of machines, that's what an original power loom looked like. This is the original sweatshop with English females working in the lines, as you can see. Today, of course, we've replaced those with rather more advanced machinery, which is now working in third world sweatshops, and more modern technology coming along, and God knows what's going to come next, biotechnology or nanotech. All those sorts of transformations are part of the nature of a capitalist economy. So he says, how can you make a profit out of this? Well, you see the possibility of power looms. You borrow from a bank, and then you might have one worker can produce as much as 6 did previously. And then given 3 conditions, you'll make a profit. First of all, the price can't fall to completely eliminate your advantage when it comes out. Secondly, the power loom must cost less than the wages of the workers you've displaced and the machinery you've displaced with it. And thirdly, you don't drive up the cost of your resources so much that you eliminate your source of profit. And then if all those 3 conditions apply, then you make a profit. So his example, just to put this visually, imagine you have an industrial process involving 6 workers, each costing $100 a day, and they're working with a machine that has $100 a day depreciation. So those are your costs. And along comes a new machine that eliminates 5 of those 6 workers, but drives wages up by $1 a day and increases and doubles depreciation. Then you get rid of 5 of those 6. You've now got those to your new costs. You might have a $101 cost for the worker rather than $100. So you might drive price down by $1 as well. Your surplus $398 a day. That's what you're ahead. That's where your profit comes from. So that's the sort of analysis to explain innovation leading to profit, which of course will fall as new competitors come in and expand at the same level of cost you have and drive prices down. So this is where profit comes from. According to Schumpeter, I would take it further than that, but this is his foundation from a Walrasian starting point, and it's necessarily cyclical because first of all, when you begin it, you've got a boost of credit that helps everybody out. As one of my good mates, Doug Nolan, used to argue, one of the main impacts of the technological innovation of the telecommunications was to improve the wages of sushi makers. Well, the people going out and buying their sushi at lunchtime and back in again. So it's a generalized boost from the expansion of credit from the narrow area where it begins across the entire society. So you actually have an inflationary period. Then, of course, once the product comes online, you then drive down the prices of what you were competing with in the first instance, and you have a slump. So there's a necessarily cyclical nature to this. It's not a continuous chain which you can just paste over the top. It'll be cyclical. Now, so you also breach the entire argument, which used to be called Say's law, and now they don't realise that they call it Walras law, that supply creates its own demand. Now he's saying aggregate demand is equal to aggregate supply plus finance coming in from entrepreneurs. And you must include that as well to analyse a dynamic changing capitalist economy. So aggregate demand exceeds that from supply alone. And again, Schumpeter argues this is essential to the whole process of change in a capitalist economy. It's not something that happens in the circular flow, as he calls it himself. The circular flow just being the sale and production and consumption of existing goods and services. So in a growing, changing economy, demand exceeds demand from receipts from selling goods alone. And the difference is financed by debt, which is mainly given to entrepreneurs. And of course, unfortunately as well, it's also given to Bernie Madoff. Okay? Credit isn't there, it goes to Ponzi schemers as well, unfortunately. So you have a fundamental shift from looking at just equilibrium in a circular flow to disequilibrium, bringing in new products and expanding the credit system as well. So we've got fully covered credit, which is the sale of goods and services, plus debt financed expenditure. We have to include both of them to model the macroeconomy properly. And he again points out this can cause inflation at one stage because additional spending powers come in. He's assuming a fully employed economy, so it must drive up the cost of factors of production. But at the end of it, of course, once the product comes in, it'll drive those prices down again. So inflation is not necessarily a bad thing at the various stages in the economic cycle in Schumpeter's thinking, where of course it is always a bad thing in neoclassical thinking. So he's arguing here that this inflation is reversed later on by the process of development. So it's the cost involved in getting new products coming into the market. I'm diving past a lot of text here. I'll put these slides to Stephen to distribute later to give you some of the flavour of Schumpeter's thinking. But this is an important strand in economic thinking which has not been put into conventional economics and has not yet been put into a model view either. But it overturns the bias that money doesn't matter. It breaches supply as demand as a view of an equilibrating market, and it also breaches Walras' law. It takes outside all of those limitations. And it argues that finance and economics can't be separated. Again, conventional economic theory slices economics from finance. This argues you must bring them all together. So at the macro level, that's the punchline. Aggregate demand, or as one of my young colleagues, Nathan Tankus, argued I should use in future, effective demand is equal to income plus the change in debt. And when I say that, instantly, and not just from neoclassicals, I get, you're double counting, Keane. You made a mathematical error there. And the reason going that isn't debts, once debt's borrowed, isn't it somebody's income? Aren't I counting it twice, therefore? You know? And when you look at the recorded data, recorded expenditure exactly the same as income. So how can I argue that there's a difference because one person's spending becomes another person's income, however that's financed? Well, it's true. Recorded income is equal to recorded expenditure. But that's not inconsistent with saying aggregate demand is income plus the change in debt. I'll give the logic later, but first of all I'll give some stats. I want to always bring us back to being an empirical discipline because economics has been totally non-empirical, courtesy of both neoclassical and Austrian fixation on a priori logic. So if it were true that aggregate income is just equal to aggregate expenditure, and my proposition that it's actually income plus change in debt were false, then I should find that if I look at the change in total debt, it should have no real correlation with economic variables of any importance at the macro level, except when the distribution of debt matters. And that's the argument that Krugman makes about us being trapped in a liquidity trap right now. So Krugman's, we had a stoush recently on the internet. I wouldn't call it a debate, because normally in debate you've got to listen to what the other side says, and he didn't do that with me. But he says, Keane asserts that putting banks in the story is essential. Now, one of these days I'll shake his hand because, boy, have I made great capital out of the next comment. Because I spent so long trying to say to people, neoclassical economists model the economy as if there's no banks, no debt, and no money. And people shake their heads and think, God, Keane must be eating something strange for dinner last night if he believes that. Surely they don't. Well, here's Krugman. I'm all for including the banking sector and storage where it's relevant, but why is it so crucial to a story about debt and leverage? Don't that say it all? Okay. Then he says, I go on to assert that lending is in addition to aggregate demand. In this slide, he's completely accurately characterising my views. No problem at all with what he says in this particular slide. He says he doesn't get that at all because, and I'm going to now go through and discuss the mathematics of this. If I decide to cut back on my spending and stash the funds in a bank, which lends them out to someone else, this doesn't have to be a net increase in demand. That's straight loanable funds thinking. And one thing again I'll thank Krugman for, he expresses his ideas very clearly, so it's easy to follow what his actual logic is. He says Keynes saying something else with the notion that creating money equals creating demand, but that isn't right in any model I understand. I'm not going to argue with that either. Okay. Now he says it does matter now because we're in a liquidity trap. We had too much optimism about debt, so debt is borrowed and spent too much. Again, this is very clear logic. So since one person's debt is another person's assets, to encourage the higher lending, there had to be higher real interest rates because you needed more savings to have that happen. Then people remembered that the debt was dangerous. They went from leveraging to deleveraging, but it wasn't symmetrical. The argument going here that you had people who used to be borrowers who were suddenly becoming savers. So to get the overall balance to be maintained in the economy, people who used to be savers have to now become spenders. They have to become borrowers themselves. But because those two groups are different, you can't drive interest rates low enough to encourage people who used to be savers to now become borrowers. You need negative real interest rates. Therefore, we're in a liquidity trap. And the fiscal policy is supposed to mean that what you do is, because there's a disequilibrium in that market, and believe me, he doesn't understand his own model because it can't allow disequilibrium. I'll show that in another paper. But he's saying because there's disequilibrium there, the government has to make up the difference. So the spending that's not being done by the people who used to be savers has to be done by the government running a deficit instead. And he says distribution is all that matters, not the level of debt. It could be any level at all, unimportant. So you could end the recession by a large enough deficit or by increasing the inflation rate. Hence the punchline to his title of his book, End this Depression Now. In other words, it could be done instantly, simply by running a larger government deficit. A burst of federal spending would do it. Now, I actually agree with the need for deficits. Okay? I'm not arguing against that at all. What I want to say is he correct in diagnosing the whole problem is just that we're in a liquidity trap? Well, there are two hypotheses that he's made in that set of statements that can actually be analysed. And I thank Matthias Griselli for pointing this out to me up in the Fields Institute recently. First of all, he's saying high interest rates will be correlated with high rates of growth of debt. And secondly, change of debt will only have a macroeconomic impact after we hit the zero lower bound. Now, let's test the first one. If you take a look at real interest rates and real rate of growth of debt, you do find a correlation. It's not over. This is the point at which the zero lower bound strikes. So beforehand, it makes sense to say that there should be some correlation, and you find it. It's not a big one. It's reasonable, 0.46 between 1980 and now. But it's actually stronger after the zero lower bound, which shouldn't really happen because even though the zero lower bound is there and you're showing negative real interest rates, that's negative of the reserve rate. Of course, mortgage rates are still above the rate of inflation. And actually weak before the zero lower, it's weaker still. So it's not strongly confirmed. It's there, but it's not a strongly confirmed hypothesis. Now, what about change in debt only having a macroeconomic impact in a liquidity trap? Well, I'm now correlating change in debt to the unemployment level. And I think anybody here called Blind Freddy? Oh, Blind Freddy's not here, but if he was, you could see there's a correlation, don't you think? Okay. His hypothesis is that there should be a strong correlation after the zero lower bound and no correlation beforehand. Now, the correlation is negative. It's a negative correlation because change in debt increases demand. So you should have with a faster rate of increase in debt, you'd have falling unemployment. So the correlation is going to be negative. It's minus 0.27 after the zero lower bound, which is a weak correlation. It's stronger across the entire time period and stronger still before the zero lower bound struck. So it's showing debt matters all the time, which doesn't fit the neoclassical hypothesis about liquidity trap. So it's neat, it's plausible, and it's empirically wrong. And I love the statement from Thomas Huxley over a century ago. The great tragedy of science is slaying of a beautiful hypothesis by an ugly fact. Well, we need a bit more of that in economics. So to take the alternative empirically deduced hypothesis that change in debt matters all the time, let's take a look at those correlations so far. Now, that correlation was with the percentage change in the level of debt. But over time, the ratio of debt to GDP has been rising quite dramatically. Back in 1970, a 10% change in debt was also, from my point of view of modelling, a 10% addition to income finance demand. But by 2009, that 10% change was a 30% addition to aggregate demand. What I need to do is deflate it not by the CPI, but by the level of the GDP, nominal GDP. That's showing the gap, by the way. The blue line is the change in debt as a percentage of GDP. 30% up here, but the red line is the percentage change on an annual basis of the level of debt. That's been fairly constant around about 10%. But 10% now is much more than 10% 30, 40 years ago. So let's take a look at the correlation now between change in debt divided by nominal GDP and unemployment. At this stage, Blind Freddy would probably have his sight restored. Correlation there is minus 0.63 after the zero lower bound, minus 0.76 across the entire time period from 1980 through to today. and it's actually stronger again before the zero lower bound, minus 0.84. You don't get correlations that strong unless you've got a causal mechanism lying behind it as well, when you're talking over a 40-year period, virtually, 35, 40 years. I can take it back 70 years and get the same type of relationship. So empirically, the argument is very strongly that change in debt matters at all times. So we need an alternative theory to explain it. And this has been part of post-Keynesian theory for over 40 years, that the money supply is endogenous. So this turns up in Michael's work as well. And Michael, the first neoclassical I've ever seen, who's included endogenous creation of money by the private banking system as part of a neoclassical model. So hats off to you, mate, on that one. Okay. Now, the new spending power created by the bank adds to demand of the entire economy without subtracting from demand from savers. And that's the essential difference with the Loanable Funds model. Where Loanable Funds says for borrowers to have more spending power, savers have to have less. Now, this is saying aggregate demand is incomes plus the change in debt. And this is the vision that Krugman has. This is conventional neoclassical thinking. We have a patient person. Oh, by the way, who do you think is a better human being, the patient or the impatient person? Isn't that pejorative, like so much neoclassical language? What about saying speculators and entrepreneurs? Okay, who's better then? Okay, so the patient lends to impatient. So you have $1 or $100 being passed across from the patient person to the impatient person. The patient loses spending power, the impatient gains it. In the aggregate, no particular change, and you can ignore banks. And importantly, all the action is on the liability side of the bank's ledger. That's the essential point about they don't have a bank in their system, so they don't actually realise that. But if you actually model it in the bank's books, this is what it would look like. There'd be nothing happening on the asset side because they see it as being a transfer from patient agents to impatient agents, and banks are simply sitting there just facilitating the transfer. And there's no change in the aggregate money supply there. And I'm using accounting conventions that an increase in liabilities is shown as a minus, so you can actually add across horizontally and get a zero sum. Here's how it appears in the post-Keynesian model. There's action on the asset side of the banking sector as well as the liability side. And the money supply grows by the size of the loan. That's the fundamental difference in the visions. And that's the part that neoclassicals can't get their head around, or if they do, of course, they end up overthrowing a large part of neoclassical logic. Now, I've actually built a software package that helps me simulate this, and I'll quickly bring that up over here if I got it running. Okay, what I've done here is using this package, I've built that table I showed you a moment ago as two tables, or I show one table showing two models of banking. In one, I've got lending from the patient agent to the impatient agent. I'm now calling the impatient agent firms, the firm sector, borrowing from the household sector, or the capitalists, borrowing from them. That's lending by the patient agent to the impatient agent. But I'm also including loans by the banking sector to the firm sector. So let's just take a look at how this model runs. I've got it at the moment that all the money is the only lending going on is the neoclassical idea of lending. And what you'll see happening here is GDP eventually stabilises. And if I change the lending parameters drastically, so at the moment I've got the patient agent lending at such a rate that if they lend at that rate and had no inflow into their accounts, it'd be 7 years before they had no money left in their accounts. That's what the 7 stands for. If I make it a larger number, it means that it'll take them 100 years to lend all the money out of their account, which means they're lending much more slowly. So if I vary that, watch what happens to GDP, which is this one here. If I make them much more conservative in lending, wow, little fall to GDP. Make them much more radical. They lend every year. They lend it. Yeah, a little increase. Not much. I'll just go back to the starting. This is a new version of the software, which is taking us a while to debug. But you can see there's not much of a change occurring, but big changes in that variable up there, not much of a change going on. Let's just now bring in bank lending. Bit of a difference. And if the banks change the rate they went from, say, 7 years out to being very conservative, then the system stops growing. And if banks lend much more rapidly, then it takes off again. that's putting the visions together, and that this effect, the capacity of the banks to create new money out of double entry bookkeeping, out of nothing, and then expand aggregate demand, is an essential part of a well-functioning capitalist economy. It's also an essential part of a collapsing one, courtesy of Ponzi schemes, which is what we've allowed them to get away with for the last decade or two, or maybe about 4 decades. So that's why it matters. When you include aggregate demand as being boosted by debt, then you get a very different vision of how the economy operates. And what the post-Keynesians argue as the model is actually what some central bankers have been trying to tell neoclassical economists for decades. So the first, my favourite, is Alan Holmes in 1969, when he was vice president of the New York Fed, trying to stop the experiment with monetarism. And he said, in the real world, banks extend credit, creating deposits in the process, and look for the reserve later, which again you have Michael saying precisely the same thing. And he says people who believe this, that you need injections of reserves beforehand, suffer from a naive assumption that the banks only expand loans after the reserves have been put into the system. He said the reserves, in fact, are backward looking. Back then, they were 2 weeks. They were based on the reserves required today were based on deposits you had 2 weeks earlier, meaning the government had to supply them. If they didn't, the government was controlled by the requirement to match what the deposits were 2 weeks earlier. Now, of course, we've got much more advanced computer systems these days, much better information systems, far higher speed transactions. So now rather than a 2-week delay, it's a month. Now, the European Central Bank, again, this is May 2012. The European Central Bank telling them the same thing. The ECB's reserve requirements are backward-looking and thus are subject to reserve requirements with the previous period, and thus after banks have extended the credit demanded by their customers. That's strictly endogenous money, and that's actually what goes on. So the actual process is like this. An entrepreneur, or unfortunately sometimes Bernie Madoff, approaches a bank and says, I've got a great idea, and the bank says, yeah, we like the idea too. Here's $1 million. By the way, you owe us $1 million. Simultaneous creation of loan and deposit, and that puts additional spending power into circulation. So aggregate demand exceeds demand from income alone. And therefore, not just neoclassical macro, I've got to say also a lot of post-Keynesian macro has made the mistake of thinking they can ignore double debt created demand because they think there's double counting going on. Now, these insights mean that all these factors can exceed. Aggregate income investment can exceed retained earnings. Aggregate consumption can exceed distributed income, wages plus distributed profits. And speculation is also debt finance. So I'm now going to take you through the logic of how you get to the argument of saying that aggregate demand is income plus change in debt. And I can't do it without mathematics. So let's just go through slowly. And this is work I did with Matthias Grasselli in the first instance up at the Fields Institute. I didn't think it would work, by the way. Matthias twisted my arm to give this a try, and I had to concede afterwards he was dead right. It made plenty of sense. So you define income, GDP measured by the income approach, as being wages plus profits. All income will resolve itself into one or the other. And divide profits into profits that are distributed as dividends and retained earnings by the firm sector. So you can now explain what profit is. And looking at expenditure on consumer goods and capital goods, I now say actual expenditure, you record it, will be consumption goods plus investment goods. And there's 2 sources of demand for that, workers and capitalists. So consumers can have wages plus the change in workers' debt. Capitalists can have distributed profits plus the change in their debt. And that one there is borrowing for workers to finance consumption. If it's negative, it's saving, so it covers either case, increasing or decreasing debt. This is borrowing by capitalists for consumption. That can also be negative, in which case they're saving. Now, there's 2 sources of demand for investment goods, either retained earnings or new debt. So investment will be retained earnings plus the change in the debt of the firm sector for investment, fixed investment. And if that's negative, you've also got savings going on by the firm sector. So it goes both ways. Now, if I compare the 2 equations, there's my expenditure equation, expanding it out completely. Rearrange it. I've got the income source expenditure in the first half and debt finance in the second. Subtract income from that expenditure equation and notice the cancellations. I'm left just with the expenditure equals income plus the change in debt. Now, probably still sounds like double counting. And now I've got to thrash this one through people's heads. And that, I think, is because of this distinction between ex ante, before the event, and ex post. And conventional thinking falls back into being ex post, which is comparing recorded expenditure with recorded income and seeing they're equal, therefore I'm wrong. But in a demand-driven economy, expenditure precedes income. And this is Schumpeter's point. You get some income from selling goods and services, yes, but you also get income from the banking sector. Now, Keynes realised this as well, but only after he wrote the general theory. So in responding to critiques of the general theory, Olin's talk about investment ex ante, he said planned investment may have to secure its financial provision before the investment takes place. So there has to be a technique to bridge that gap, and he says you can get it either from new issue market or from the banks. So banks creating credit as part of enabling investment to occur without needing the revenue from selling goods beforehand in the first instance. So this recorded equality of the two is where the confusion comes from. And the way to get around this, again, Matthias formalised this, is to realise that debt is a discontinuous injection into a continuous stream of economic activity. So if you look at spending going on at wages and income, wages and profits, and then at some point someone borrows some money and spends that money into the economy. You've got an injection at that instant of a new source of demand into the economy. Now, after it's been borrowed, it's boosted incomes. If you go shopping down the road with your credit card, after you swipe the card, somebody's income is represented by your change in debt. Okay? But if you didn't swipe your card, that person wouldn't have that income. So this is the logic here. If you look at the flow of wages and profits over time, that is income at time t. And that is change in debt at time t. And that is expenditure at time t. It occurs across the discontinuity. Now, when you record it, you're working backwards. And you record backwards, you'll find income at time t being exactly the same. But this discontinuity is what's throwing people on that whole logic, because when you measured income at time t, you're looking at the limit of that function as you approach it from the future, looking backwards. So you can call that yi measured at t plus, where s goes towards t. That's identical to expenditure at time t, and that is equal to income measured on the other side plus the change in debt. So that's the logic. That's why people can get so confused about it. And if you look at the income before the debt injection, it's less than expenditure and income after. So there's income before the injection of debt. That's going to be less than expenditure at that time. Expenditure at that time will be equal to income after you've had the debt injection. The measure of the two, they'll be the same. But expenditure will be equal to income before the debt injection plus debt injection. That's all it comes down to. And that's what's been missed in conventional thinking about why we have sectoral balances, therefore debt can't matter, which is a lot of post-Keynesians still think that way. But in fact, they're missing out this impact of the discontinuous injection of debt. Matthias, when he first worked this out, was very happy with this next point. He said there's actually a mathematical law as to why you will find an identity between recorded income and recorded expenditure while still having this dynamic going on. And he said if you look at the dynamic again, if you're going to measure what income is over time, you're effectively integrating a set of flows. This is the flow of income you're integrating to get the change over time. According to rule of mathematics, if you have functions that differ at only a finitely many points of discontinuities, they must have the same integral. So what we're finding in measuring and saying they're exactly equal to each other is just a simple mathematical law, not a simple mathematical law, a complicated one involving what's called Lebesgue integrals, and the Lebesgue measure of what is a zero space. But recorded expenditure and recorded income over a finite time are necessarily equal. That doesn't rule out. In fact, it's consistent with the case I've been saying that expenditure is income plus the change in debt. Now, to generalise this, I've just talked about, I've left out the asset market so far, but of course we spend money on assets as well. And if I just consider capitalists being the ones who speculate, then they can speculate from distributed profits, plus they can also borrow money for it. So I now look at that, the same cancellations come out. Part of the increase in expenditure is gambling on asset prices with borrowed money. And if I take the government sector into account as well, then expenditure now includes net government spending, G minus T, and we know that is equal to the change in government debt. So I go through it again, I get the same cancellations. Aggregate expenditure includes the change in government debt. So all that I'm showing here is a necessary consequence of realising that money is endogenously created by the banks. If some expenditure is debt financed and we don't have loanable funds applying so that loan increases the spending power of borrowers, then aggregate demand differs from income. Okay? Yeah. It's absolutely necessary consequence of endogenous money. And it's the key factor in explaining why we had a crisis. Because again, as I showed you that first chart, the decline in GDP is quite mild. Add on the decline in debt, it's dramatic. You can identify where the crisis began. And you can also generalise and look at how does this all feed into the way the economy operates. Again, saying there are two sources of demand, income and borrowing. There are also two categories of supply, goods and services, which is all economists normally model in their macro models, but also the sale of our financial assets. And Schumpeter argued that income is mainly spent on consumption and change in debt's the main source of investment. We can quibble about that, but it's a good starting point. Minsky also says the change in debt finances what Ponzi financiers do. So I can match wages and profits across to consumption and the change in debt mainly across to investment and speculation on assets. So with that particular argument, I've now put the other side of my equation. Having gone for the demand side, I'm now including the supply side. And looking at what I call net asset turnover, you can break that down into the price level of assets times their quantity times the turnover on an annual basis. And what you can then get from that is the change in debt as a factor in employment, but also looking at the rate of change of demand now includes the acceleration of debt. So the acceleration of debt is going to be correlated with change in asset prices. And this gives you an explanation of why asset prices must burst, because nothing can accelerate forever, not even bankers. So I wonder about their bonuses. Now here's looking at the change in debt added to GDP back in the Great Depression. And you can see there was a small boost to aggregate demand from the change in debt in the lead up to the crisis, but a huge cut down here. And the government made a minor impact on boosting aggregate demand, but it wasn't until 33, 34 that you started getting positive contribution from aggregate debt, and not until 35 you started getting positive contribution from private debt. Notice the dip here as well. This is the inexplicable turn down, the return of the Great Depression towards the end back in 37. You can correlate all of this with the impact of change in debt, amplifying the situation. This, I did rather too quickly, this is the private situation, the current situation. Look at how much higher the debt contribution was back in the Great Depression and how much larger the government contribution was, bringing us back to a positive level in terms of change of debt in the aggregate, adding to aggregate demand now. Now I'm going to take a look at GDP change correlated with employment and acceleration of debt correlated with change in employment. And that's the overall pattern. You expect a pretty strong correlation between change in real GDP and change in private employment. And it's obvious that this was a fairly deep downturn, but there have been others. Why was this one so much worse than, say, back in the 1950s? Well, let's now compare acceleration in debt. Can you see the difference? That's how fast debt decelerated during the crisis. And notice the rebound. But also watch this. It's coming back down again. Okay? So I think we're in for another, the double dip that people have been talking about has been driven by the dynamics of acceleration. And once you look at this, empirically, why do we listen to, 99.999% of the world's neoclassical economists? Listen to one, but forget the rest. Yeah. No, that's just private debt.
Government debt offset.
Yeah, it does. It goes in the opposite direction. I include that in my modelling later, but just to go to the private debt shock. Now let's also take a look at what happens to asset prices. This is looking at the deviation from the trend to 1995 of the Dow Jones, deflated by the CPI. And once you look at that, it's bleeding the obvious. We've been through the biggest stock market bubble in history. It dwarfs the 1920s. It's bigger than 1966, which was the point when Minsky said we changed from being a robust financial society to a fragile one. This is the correlation of acceleration in debt and the deviation from the Dow Jones on an annual basis. 0.65 across the period of the Great Depression. Not as strong now, but still there. Clearly the deceleration of debt played a major role in the crunch on the Dow Jones. Now, of course, that's looking at aggregate debt, not debt just specifically for speculating on asset markets. And I haven't been able to find decent data in America on margin loans, which clearly are related to, far more tightly related to what happens on the stock market. But I did find it for Australia, and I've got to admit this one made me gasp when I saw it, even though I'd expect the relationship. This is the correlation of acceleration in mortgage debt and change in the Australian stock market. That's 0.81. Okay? The argument is incontrovertible if you look at the data. Similarly for housing. Where did your housing bubble come from and where did it go? The acceleration of mortgage debt explains it. That's the correlation of acceleration of mortgage debt to house price movements on using a Case-Shiller index deflated by the CPI. So the case is overwhelming. And to come back to how we have to think about it, monetary macroeconomics has to be disequilibrium. Now, if you look at how the Neoclassicals, and again Michael's the exception here, look at this, they talk about everything explained by the equilibrium system subject to a shock. So what caused 2008? Simple, a shock. And it had to be a demand shock. You know why? Well, it was a supply one. We would have had inflation. Duh. This is so dumb. This is supposed to be leading neoclassical thinking. There had to be a shock to explain it. Couldn't be the system itself. It wasn't endogenous. And then how do we know it was a demand shock? Because if there had been a supply shock, it would have been inflationary. Well, that's deep. So it's not an exogenous shock. It's an endogenous collapse in debt finance demand. And if we look at how long it could go on for, that's the ratio of debt to GDP, the red line being private debt, the blue being the one that politicians are obsessing about, public debt, which is trivial by comparison. And if you extrapolate forward the current rate of decline of debt, if we keep on that trajectory, it could take us about 20 years to get back to the levels we used to have during the 1960s. That's how long this crunch could last. We don't do something deliberate about it in policy terms. Now, I know that sounds extreme, but what about Japan? Imagine if I'd said to you in 1990, Japan is going to be in a slump for 2 decades plus. I would have been laughed off the stage, wouldn't I? Not a laughing matter anymore. Now, current policy, ironically, is directed at increasing lending. The objective of QE is to reduce the cost of borrowing money so there'll be more borrowing into the economy. The whole thing is being predicated on trying to revive the bubble that's already burst. So we need new thinking to escape this crisis. And this is the start of my contribution. Thank you.